Hey guys, tonight we're taking you inside a wedding so inhuman and so suffocatingly cruel, you'll wonder how anyone made it down the aisle without collapsing. We're not talking about fairy tale gowns, horse-drawn carriages, or delicate bouquets. No, tonight's story is about what it was really like to survive a Victorian wedding. So before you get cozy, I'd really appreciate a quick like or even a subscribe. It helps way more than you know. And hey, I'm always curious where you're tuning in from. Drop a comment with your city and what time it is for you. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Congratulations, you've just woken up in the year 1875. The good news, you're getting married. The bad news, you're the bride. Your gown is heavy enough to crush a donkey and dyed a delicate shade of green with arsenic, which is slowly eating through your skin like a very polite acid. Your corset is laced so tight that every breath feels like a negotiation, and fainting isn't a possibility. It's a guarantee. Romantic, isn't it? You blink awake in a lavish Victorian parlour that smells like roses, beeswax polish, and faint mildew. There's no soft white silk bedsheet, only scratchy linens pressed within an inch of their life by someone who hasn't washed them in weeks. You're surrounded by lace, ruffles, and enough fabric to upholster a small theatre, but the air is so heavy with coal dust from the city outside that even this special day feels a little like choking. The mirror tells you you're pale and delicate, which Victorians love to romanticise. What it doesn't tell you is that your kidneys are about to be crushed by 20 pounds of tightly bound whalebone. And this is just the morning. The wedding itself hasn't even begun. The church bells have barely stopped ringing before you're swept into the reception hall, a place that looks elegant at first glance but quickly reveals itself as a culinary ambush. The room is thick with the heat of bodies pressed shoulder to shoulder, wool suits mingling with perfumed dresses, and the unmistakable undercurrent of spoiled meat masked by flowers wilting in their vases. You sit at a long table draped in white linen that has been reused so many times it carries stains from marriages past, and the first dish to arrive is a tower of jelly that quivers as though it is alive. Victorians adored gelatinous creations, believing them the height of refinement, but what you are staring at is less art and more edible taxidermy. Suspended inside the translucent wobble are chunks of fish, chicken, and occasionally hard-boiled eggs, trapped as if mid-scream. This was called a savoury aspic, and it was considered luxurious, although one wrong sniff makes you realise refrigeration was hardly reliable in an era when ice came from frozen lakes dragged into underground pits and rationed like treasure. The Victorians had a flair for presentation that was unmatched, but their ingredients were often far past their prime. Beef might arrive streaked with green, poultry could carry the tang of rot, and pork was always a gamble. Spices like nutmeg and cloves were not just about flavour, they were camouflage, used to disguise the taste of something already turning. Food historians note that recipes from the period called for absurd amounts of sugar or salt, not because the Victorian palate was excessive, but because the meat needed to be bullied into cooperation. Imagine hiding spoiled leftovers under a mountain of cinnamon and congratulating yourself for culinary genius. What made matters worse was the obsession with excess. A wedding feast was judged not by quality, but by how many dishes could be crammed onto the table at once. Dozens of courses might appear, each more questionable than the last, a parade of goose pies, oyster patties, and calf's head soup, all fighting for space while flies hovered above the display like honoured guests. Banquets could stretch for hours, with guests expected to shovel it down in between endless toasts and speeches. By the time dessert arrived, which could include fruit that had fermented into something close to vinegar, you were left with a stomach that felt like it had been mugged in an alleyway. Alcohol did not help. Victorian punch bowls were filled with concoctions so strong they blurred the line between beverage and chemical weapon. Wine was often watered down, so people turned instead to fortified spirits laced with sugar, citrus, and sometimes milk curdled for effect. One popular drink, milk punch, was a mixture of brandy, rum and lemon juice poured over scalded milk that separated into clumps before being strained. The result looked like cloudy water but hit the bloodstream with the force of a hammer. It was the kind of beverage that could make you forget your own name by the second glass, which was convenient when you realised you had just eaten jellied fish floating in vinegar syrup. The feast was not just about eating, it was about showing off. Families bankrupt themselves to provide abundance, hiring cooks to assemble monstrous centerpieces that could include entire animals posed as though they were still alive. A roasted peacock might arrive with its feathers stitched back onto the carcass, wings fanned as if ready to take flight from the middle of the table. It was spectacle over sustenance, and guests applauded the sight without daring to ask how long the bird had been sitting in the kitchen before it was decorated like a feathered corpse. If you were unlucky enough to taste it, you discovered quickly that peacock meat was tough, stringy, and about as pleasant as chewing rope. But to decline was unthinkable. Etiquette was a battlefield all its own. Forks were relatively new to widespread use in England, and not everyone knew how to handle them gracefully. Napkins were often ignored, with grease wiped on sleeves or conveniently on the tablecloth. Guests gorged themselves noisily while trying to maintain the illusion of refinement, which meant the room was filled with the sound of slurping, belching, and cutlery clattering like a small forge. If you were seated near the bride and groom, you were expected to perform admiration at every turn, smiling as though your mouth were not currently on fire from mustard, so potent it made your eyes water. Hygiene added another layer of dread. Kitchens were chaotic places filled with coal smoke, boiling cauldrons, and servants who had been awake since before dawn. Washing hands was not standard practice, and rats were not unwelcome visitors. In London especially, food markets sold meat that had been hanging in the open air for days, riddled with flies and occasionally maggots, which cooks scraped away before serving. Butter frequently went rancid. Bread was sometimes cut with plaster dust to make it appear whiter, and milk might already be sour by the time it was poured. And yet here it all was, dressed up for the wedding feast as though a little garnish of parsley could erase centuries of bacterial warfare. You shift uncomfortably in your chair as another dish arrives, this one a massive pie large enough to hide a dog inside. When it's cut open, instead of steam rising, a flock of live birds bursts out, wings beating frantically against the chandeliers. This was not uncommon. In fact, the idea of entremet, theatrical dishes meant to impress, sometimes involved animals placed inside baked shells so they could provide surprise entertainment. Guests gasped in delight while you ducked to avoid a pigeon clipping your ear. The pie itself, now a deflated crust, was still served, although you were expected to ignore the feathers lodged in the filling. The scale of waste was staggering. Wealthy families hosted receptions where food enough for hundreds was prepared, much of it ending up discarded after sitting out for hours. For the poor, marriage meals were simpler, often consisting of bread, cheese, and ale shared communally, which in retrospect might have been safer for digestion. The grotesque irony was that the lavish feasts of the elite left people sick more often than the humble meals of peasants. Foodborne illness was so common it was often dismissed as indigestion, even when it led to days of violent illness or death. And yet, despite the hazards, the feast was considered the centerpiece of the celebration. To attend was to endure, to pretend you were savouring delicacies while quietly praying your stomach held out. The laughter, the clinking glasses, the endless speeches all blurred together in a haze of spoiled meats and chemical alcohol, and by the end of the night you were left wondering how anyone survived long enough to call it wedded bliss. As you lean back, clutching your aching gut, the musicians strike up a tune and the tables are cleared for dancing. You realise that while the food may have been a battle, the next ordeal is about to begin. Because in Victorian weddings, the dance floor was not about joy, it was about survival. The tables are shoved aside, the greasy remains of peacock and aspic swept into the corners, and suddenly the room is cleared for the grand spectacle of the wedding dance. The air is humid with sweat, coal smoke from the lamps, and the faint whiff of food that has been trampled underfoot. You're pushed forward into the crowd, corsets still pressing into your ribs as the musicians lift their instruments and prepare to unleash hours of relentless sound. This is the part of the wedding meant to symbolize joy and unity. But what it really symbolizes is aching feet, gasping lungs, and etiquette so strict it makes standing still feel like a crime. The Victorians loved order, and dancing was no exception. Forget swaying gently or improvising with the rhythm. These dances were carefully choreographed, with manuals written by dancing masters that outlined every step. The quadrille, a favourite at weddings, required groups of 4 couples performing synchronised movements that resembled a militarised square. One wrong move, and you risk colliding with lace sleeves or tripping under the skirts of a neighbouring bride's cousin. To outsiders it looked refined. To participants, it was closer to a traffic accident in slow motion. And the costumes made it worse. Heavy gowns dragged across the floor, sweeping up crumbs and ash, while stiff suits trapped heat like portable furnaces. Women's corsets forced them upright, shoulders pinned back as if nailed to invisible boards, which meant bending or breathing deeply was out of the question. Men fared little better, sweating through layers of waistcoats and starched collars so stiff they sometimes cut into the skin. All of this, paired with music that stretched on without mercy, created an atmosphere less of celebration and more of compulsory exercise. Imagine being forced to attend a wedding Zumba class where every step is policed, and fainting is the only available excuse to leave early. Music itself was not always a relief. Violins screeched, flutes wheezed, and pianos thundered, all amplified by echoing halls designed more for ceremony than acoustics. If the musicians were amateurs, which many were, the results bordered on torture. Guests smiled and clapped politely, pretending the cacophony was uplifting, while secretly praying for the final chord. Historical records describe entire evenings where dancing went until dawn, fueled by alcohol, exhaustion, and the desperate need to prove social standing. Declining a dance was considered rude, so even if your corset felt like it was puncturing your ribs, you were expected to smile, curtsy, and shuffle across the floor with the grace of a collapsing bookshelf. Dancing also carried an unspoken surveillance. Couples were observed carefully by families, friends, and lurking neighbours, each step interpreted as a symbol of character. If you stumbled, it reflected badly on your upbringing. If you appeared too enthusiastic, it was whispered that you were shameless. The dance floor was less a place of joy and more a Victorian microscope, magnifying every imperfection into a potential scandal. Entire matches were judged by how 2 people managed to endure a polka without collapsing. Romance was never left to chance. It was choreographed, monitored, and often suffocating. Etiquette manuals warned women never to appear sweaty or out of breath, which was comical considering they were bound in steel and whalebone. To assist with this impossible expectation, women sometimes dabbed vinegar-soaked sponges under their collars to stave off fainting, though the result was smelling faintly like salad dressing. Men powdered their faces to avoid appearing red, which in the dim glow of lamplight made them resemble ghosts swaying in rhythm. The illusion of elegance was everything, even if it felt like your lungs were begging for parole. And then there were the rituals that surrounded the dance. One particularly cruel tradition involved the bride being paraded around the floor, while guests attempted to cut locks of her hair or pieces of her gown for keepsakes. Imagine trying to waltz gracefully while strangers lunged at your clothing with scissors. It was considered charming, though to modern eyes it looks like sanctioned mugging. By the end of the night, the bride often resembled a rag doll, her gown shredded and veil full of holes, smiling through clenched teeth as though being stripped in public was the epitome of refinement. The garter toss, still recognised today in modified form, was another uncomfortable practice. In Victorian times, guests sometimes fought over the bride's garter with a ferocity that bordered on riotous. Men scrambled to grab it, believing it brought luck, while women clutched pieces of the gown for fertility charms. Historical anecdotes describe brides nearly knocked over during these scrambles, their dresses torn, their dignity left on the dance floor. What began as superstition ended as chaos, and yet it was all considered perfectly normal. The music pounded on, the floorboards groaned, and by the time midnight struck, the room was a fog of sweat and candle smoke. Children slept under tables, men collapsed into chairs with collars undone, and women fainted discreetly in corners while servants fanned them with whatever could be found. Yet the dance never truly ended. Even as exhaustion claimed the guests, there was always one more quadrille, one more reel, one more polka to stumble through. Endurance, not joy, defined the Victorian wedding celebration. As you stagger toward the door for air, your head buzzing with noise and the taste of spoiled punch still clinging to your tongue, you realise the night is not finished. The dancing may have tested your body, but the next tradition will test your spirit. Because once the music fades, the attention shifts to the bedroom, and the so-called wedding night rituals reveal an entirely new layer of inhuman expectation. The music dwindles, the last waltz collapses into silence, and the guests stagger out into the fog of a Victorian street. You're left in a room thick with candle smoke, wilted flowers, and the faint smell of spilled punch that has seeped into the carpet. The bride is pale, corset laces still digging into her ribs, her gown shredded from enthusiastic guests who snipped away souvenirs. The groom looks equally battered, collar soaked with sweat, face powdered to a ghastly shade of white. Yet this spectacle is not over. In fact, for Victorians, this is when the real scrutiny began, because the wedding night was less about privacy and more about proving that the marriage was legitimate. In the 19th century, society was obsessed with consummation. It was not enough to have a ceremony witnessed by family, clergy, and neighbours. The act of marriage had to be physically completed, and that completion was often treated like a business receipt. Diaries, etiquette manuals, and even medical tracts of the period stressed the importance of a successful first night, as though it were a contract sealed in flesh. Failure could mean scandal, lawsuits, or even annulment. To modernise, the notion is absurd, but for Victorians it was deadly serious. There are accounts of brides fainting on the way to the bedroom, corsets still crushing their lungs, only to be revived by maids tasked with assisting in the process. These attendants were sometimes expected to undress the couple, lace and unlace garments, and even remain outside the room as chaperones to ensure nothing was amiss. Privacy was a luxury rarely afforded. For wealthier households, the consummation could be treated like a public ritual. Guests lingered in adjoining rooms, listening for sounds that confirmed the act had taken place. In certain circles, the sheets were inspected the following morning as proof of virginity, a humiliating and invasive tradition that reduced intimacy to forensic evidence. The pressure placed on the bride was staggering. Victorian ideals cast women as pure, delicate creatures who were expected to know nothing of physical love before marriage. Yet on the wedding night, they were suddenly required to transform into compliant partners. Medical texts of the time warned against female desire, describing it as dangerous or unnatural, and insisted that women should approach intimacy with modest reluctance. Men, on the other hand, were encouraged to see the act as both duty and right. This imbalance created a night less about mutual affection and more about performance under duress. Adding to the absurdity was the Victorian obsession with medicalised control. Doctors wrote entire treatises on the risks of sexual activity, warning that too much enthusiasm could cause everything from hysteria to physical collapse. Some even claimed that a poorly managed wedding night could lead to madness or infertility. Couples were told to approach the act with restraint, as though it were an exam graded by unseen authorities. This advice, paired with the crushing garments, suffocating atmosphere, and total lack of real education, ensured that most experiences were awkward, painful, and terrifying rather than romantic. Superstition added another layer of cruelty. It was believed that omens on the wedding night predicted the success of the union. If the bride wept, it meant future sorrow. If the groom hesitated, whispers of impotence followed him for life. In rural areas, neighbours sometimes played pranks by banging pots outside the chamber door, a ritual called charivari, meant to embarrass the couple into proving themselves. Imagine collapsing into bed after 12 hours of feasting and dancing, only to be serenaded by the clanging of iron and drunken singing from your community. Sleep was not an option. The garments themselves were obstacles. A Victorian bride could wear up to 10 layers of fabric, from chemises to petticoats, topped with steel-boned corsets, and gowns heavy enough to crush a small dog. Removing these required assistance, which was why maids were often present. The process could take nearly an hour, hardly the recipe for romance. Meanwhile, the grooms struggled with stiff collars, endless buttons, and boots that required hooks to remove. By the time both were finally free of their clothing, exhaustion had set in, along with the awareness that a dozen relatives were waiting for confirmation of their success. For the unlucky, the ordeal did not end with the first night. In some communities, the bedding ceremony involved guests intruding into the chamber, offering advice, or even singing bawdy songs while the couple lay awkwardly under covers. Though less common by the later Victorian period, these traditions lingered in rural areas, creating nights that were more circus than celebration. The boundary between private life and public spectacle simply did not exist. The expectation of fertility hung heavily over the marriage bed. The bride's body was treated as a vessel for heirs, and failure to produce children quickly led to gossip. Women who struggled with conception were labelled defective, while men often escaped blame regardless of their health. Medical treatments for infertility ranged from herbal concoctions to bizarre electrical devices meant to stimulate vitality, all sold in earnest to desperate couples. In this climate, the wedding night was not just an intimate act, but the opening salvo in a lifelong campaign of reproduction. Even the architecture reflected these pressures. Many Victorian homes lacked true privacy, with thin walls, shared corridors, and servants constantly passing through. Newlyweds could rarely escape observation. Letters from the era describe the awkwardness of being overheard, the embarrassment of creaking beds, and the terror of falling short of expectations. Instead of intimacy, the wedding night often delivered humiliation, exhaustion, and a sense of being watched by an invisible jury. You shift uncomfortably at the thought, realizing that what is often portrayed in novels as tender romance was, in reality, a performance laced with fear, superstition, and absurd medical advice. The candles sputter in the bedroom, the sheets hang heavy with scrutiny, and the night stretches long and merciless. And just when you think the ordeal is complete, morning arrives, and with it another trial. Because Victorian weddings did not end at the bedroom door. They spilled into the honeymoon, a journey that promised relaxation but delivered exhaustion, danger, and more public spectacle. The candles in the bridal chamber have barely guttered out before another ordeal begins, one packaged neatly in society's insistence on tradition. The honeymoon, often imagined as a time of rest and tender bonding, was for Victorians a punishing expedition that felt more like a public parade than a private retreat. Bags were packed before the vows had even finished echoing through the church. Carriages were readied at the door and relatives waved as though sending soldiers off to war. Instead of quiet time together, the couple was thrust into travel that was exhausting, costly, and riddled with inconveniences. The very concept of the honeymoon was not ancient at all. It became fashionable in Britain during the early 19th century, modelled after continental customs where upper-class couples travelled to scenic spots immediately after marriage. The Victorians seized on the idea with enthusiasm, turning it into an expectation rather than a choice. By the mid-century, guidebooks promoted honeymoon itineraries that spanned from the English seaside to the Alps, each promising beauty and refinement but delivering damp inns, suspicious food, and travel sickness. What was marketed as romance often collapsed into fatigue. Carriage travel was brutal. Roads outside major cities were still rutted with mud, horses often stumbled, and journeys stretched on for days. Couples endured constant jolting, the clatter of wheels and the smell of leather mixed with manure. Steam trains promised speed, but introduced their own miseries. The compartments filled with smoke, cinders burned holes in clothing, and coal dust blackened everything. Newlyweds emerging from a train often looked less like blissful lovers and more like miners crawling out of a shaft. Accommodations were no reprieve. Inns and boarding houses along popular honeymoon routes frequently advertised cleanliness, but delivered the opposite. Mattresses sagged with years of use, lice thrived in the sheets, and chamber pots overflowed in corners. Bedbugs were infamous companions, often mentioned in letters and diaries with despairing resignation. A couple might arrive exhausted, only to spend the night scratching at bites or choking on musty air heavy with damp plaster. Privacy was scarce, with thin walls amplifying every sound and nosy hosts eager to gossip about the new arrivals. Instead of restful intimacy, the nights often provided humiliation and discomfort. Meals on the road continued the pattern of grotesque indulgence that had already plagued the wedding feast. In coastal towns, oysters were consumed in dangerous quantities, even though refrigeration was minimal and contamination common. Inland, meats were salted to the point of desiccation. Bread was dense and sometimes stretched with sawdust or chalk, and milk carried the sour tang of questionable storage. Wealthier couples ordered elaborate meals, which innkeepers often supplied by simply reheating whatever had been left from the previous day. Wine could be watered down or adulterated with lead-based preservatives, leaving the honeymooner with headaches that had little to do with romance. The honeymoon was not private either. Couples were often accompanied by servants, who managed luggage, clothing, and meals, ensuring that intimacy was shadowed by watchful eyes. In aristocratic families, correspondence was expected during the trip, with letters sent back home detailing the progress of the union. The irony was staggering. While novels painted honeymoons as escapes into passion, reality made them bureaucratic affairs recorded like military campaigns. Journals, receipts, and schedules were kept diligently, transforming the experience into paperwork with a side of seasickness. Seaside destinations like Brighton or Margate were fashionable, but these resorts were hardly idyllic. Crowds packed the beaches, bathing machines trundled into the waves carrying nervous bathers, and the smell of rotting seaweed mingled with coal smoke from nearby piers. Honeymooners promenaded in stiff clothing, trying to appear elegant while their boots filled with sand and salt spray stained their skirts. The sea was romantic in paintings, but in person it was a windy, gritty, and often chilly trial that tested patience more than it inspired affection. For those with greater wealth, continental tours beckoned. Paris, Rome, and the Swiss Alps were promoted as must-see destinations for cultured couples. But travel abroad carried its own hazards. Language barriers turned ordering dinner into a comedy of errors, luggage was frequently lost or stolen, and illness followed travellers like a shadow. Cholera and typhoid outbreaks were common, and foreign water supplies were often unsafe for British stomachs. Diaries describe weeks of intestinal distress, with brides confined to lodgings while grooms wrote apologetic notes home. The so-called grand honeymoon became a test of endurance against microbes and miscommunication. There was also the looming expectation of fertility. Families whispered eagerly about whether the honeymoon would result in conception, treating the trip not as leisure but as a laboratory for producing heirs. This pressure coloured every moment, turning even the most mundane stops into stages for speculation. Servants reported back on the couple's health, relatives counted the days, and society waited for evidence of success. Romance vanished under the weight of duty. The honeymoon was less a celebration of love than a monitored experiment in reproduction. Even the clothing sabotaged the trip. Brides were expected to travel in portions of their wedding wardrobe, which meant dragging along gowns heavy with lace and satin. Corsets remained mandatory, ensuring that every meal was eaten with shallow breaths. Groom's attire, layered and formal, left him sweating on train platforms and freezing in mountain passes. Luggage swelled with outfits for every occasion, forcing couples to manage trunks heavier than some of the carriages carrying them. Lost luggage was a constant disaster, often leaving a couple stranded with nothing but the clothing on their backs until new garments could be purchased at great cost. Letters and caricatures from the period revealed just how disastrous honeymoons could be. Satirical magazines like Punch lampooned the entire ordeal, portraying couples slumped in railway compartments, brides fainting on cliffsides, and grooms wrangling with unruly luggage. The humour captured what polite society refused to admit. The honeymoon was rarely blissful. It was exhausting travel wrapped in suffocating expectation, a ritual that drained wallets and spirits with equal efficiency. By the time couples returned home, they were often ill, broke, and weary, greeted not with sympathy but with new responsibilities. Guests demanded stories of their travels, families asked intrusive questions, and gossip filled the gaps left by silence. Whatever romance had been imagined was quickly overshadowed by fatigue and public curiosity. The supposed paradise of the honeymoon revealed itself as another inhuman practice, less about joy than about appearances, duty, and survival. You wipe coal dust from your face, your stomach still reeling from questionable oysters, as the carriage pulls into the family estate. The honeymoon may be over, but the rituals continue, because once the travelling is finished, the next ordeal begins with the Victorian obsession for wedding gifts, and the strange, sometimes humiliating economy that surrounded them. The luggage from the honeymoon is barely unpacked before another trial looms, one no less suffocating than the vows or the corsets. The Victorian wedding gift economy was its own beast, a tangled web of obligation, competition, and public spectacle that turned generosity into a form of warfare. In an age obsessed with appearances, a gift was never simply a token of affection. It was a declaration of wealth, status, and social climbing, wrapped in ribbons and displayed for all to see. The practice of giving wedding presents was not new, but in the 19th century it exploded into something almost industrial. Newspapers of the era reported on the gifts given at high-profile weddings, listing them in painstaking detail like inventory sheets. Silver tea services, porcelain figurines, clocks, vases, and endless embroidered linens filled pages, each item attached to the name of its donor. These lists were not private records but public announcements, ensuring that everyone knew exactly how generous or how stingy a family had been. To be omitted was social death. For middle-class families, the pressure was crushing. Even those with modest incomes felt compelled to present something substantial, often spending far beyond their means to keep up appearances. A guest might pawn valuables or sacrifice months of wages to purchase a suitable item, knowing that failure would lead to whispers of disrespect. The gift table at a Victorian wedding was less a display of affection and more a scoreboard of social ambition. It was not about what the bride and groom needed, it was about what their circle wanted to prove. The irony, of course, was that many of the gifts were useless. Silver serving sets arrived in multiples, each requiring expensive polishing that consumed servants' time. Decorative porcelain statues filled mantelpieces fragile and impractical. Embroidered linens were often too ornate to use, destined to sit in trunks until moths discovered them. Instead of practical help for a new household, the couple was saddled with a museum of fragile objects they neither wanted nor had space for. Guests congratulated themselves on their generosity, while the recipients quietly wondered where to store a fourth identical clock. The obsession with display reached absurd heights. In wealthier homes, wedding gifts were exhibited in drawing rooms for weeks after the ceremony, open for visitors to inspect. Guests were invited to view the collection, admiring the glittering array of silver, glass and lace as though it were an art gallery. The bride became less a newlywed and more a curator, walking acquaintances past tables groaning under the weight of social competition. Every item carried a story, not of sentiment but of obligation. You could not simply thank a friend. You had to thank them publicly, conspicuously, and often repeatedly. Etiquette manuals dedicated chapters to the subject. They prescribed how to choose an appropriate gift based on social rank, how to wrap it, how to deliver it, and even how to phrase accompanying notes. Deviations from these rules invited scandal. If the wrapping was deemed shabby, whispers began. If the note was too brief, it was judged as cold. Every detail was scrutinised with the same intensity as the wedding vows themselves. The couple was smothered under expectations before they had even settled into their new lives. One particularly cruel custom was the presentation party, where gifts were handed over in person in front of an audience. Guests paraded forward, offering their tokens while others looked on. It was a theatre of generosity, one designed to shame anyone whose contribution seemed inadequate. Imagine standing in line, clutching a modest embroidered handkerchief, while the person ahead of you unveils a gilded tea service imported from France. The hierarchy was instantly clear, and the humiliation lingered long after the ceremony. Not even cash could escape judgment. While money might have been more useful than yet another porcelain figurine, presenting currency was considered vulgar. It signalled a lack of imagination, or worse, an admission of lower status. Instead, wealth had to be displayed in objects, preferably ornate and impractical, each gleaming piece a silent boast. Couples could not decline these offerings without insult. They were forced to accept the mountain of unnecessary items, even when it meant drowning in clutter. For servants, the gift economy created fresh burdens. Silver had to be polished constantly, linens catalogued and stored, fragile glass dusted regularly. A household might expand its inventory tenfold overnight, requiring more labour without providing any real utility. Servants joked in letters about the absurdity of maintaining objects that were rarely touched but always displayed. Behind the glitter, the system created more work and less comfort, all for the sake of appearances. Even theft was a problem. With gifts piled high and displayed publicly, opportunists sometimes slipped items away. Newspapers carried stories of stolen wedding presents, adding another layer of anxiety. Families fretted over guarding their hoards, sometimes stationing servants near the display to watch for suspicious hands. The gifts were supposed to symbolize generosity, but in practice they attracted envy, resentment, and crime. The entire ritual revealed Victorian contradictions. Marriage was supposedly sacred, about unity and devotion, yet gifts turned it into commerce, a transaction measured in silver and lace. The true function of the presents was not to support the couple, but to reinforce the hierarchy of society, ensuring everyone knew their place. Generosity was weaponized, affection transformed into competition, and intimacy buried under porcelain clutter. You step back from the glittering tables, eyes dazzled by polished silver and glass, and feel the weight of it pressing down. These are not gifts of love. They are trophies of obligation, each one a reminder that Victorian weddings were less about union and more about theatre. And as the couple attempts to navigate this mountain of useless generosity, another expectation looms. Because no matter how heavy the gifts, the real burden was yet to come, in the form of debts, bills, and the crushing cost of maintaining appearances long after the last piece of cake had gone stale. The mountain of silver, porcelain, and embroidered linens glitters under the parlour lamps, but while guests admire the trophies, the family quietly counts the cost. Victorian weddings were not just emotionally draining, they were financial sinkholes. Every lace trim, every hired carriage, every overstuffed banquet table represented a bill that needed to be paid, and most families bled themselves dry to keep up appearances. Marriage was less about love and more about staging a performance so elaborate that it could ruin you before the honeymoon even ended. The expectation of spectacle was relentless. By the mid-19th century, weddings had become opportunities to showcase wealth, even when there was none to spare. Invitations were printed on costly cards engraved with ornate flourishes, a luxury item that often had to be ordered from specialist printers. Dresses were custom-made, requiring not only fine fabrics, but also the labour of seamstresses who spent weeks sewing, beading, and embroidering gowns that weighed nearly as much as the bride herself. Flowers, imported or forced out of season, adorned churches and halls, their price climbing higher than most households spent on food in a month. Food costs alone could be catastrophic. A proper Victorian feast demanded dozens of dishes, not just one or two. Goose pies, oyster patties, and entire roasted animals displayed like trophies drained the family coffers. Imported delicacies like pineapples or oranges were purchased at obscene prices to impress guests, sometimes rented for display if the family could not afford to actually buy them. Yes, fruit could be rented. Households paid for the privilege of putting a pineapple on the table as a centerpiece, only to return it after the event so it could dazzle at another wedding down the street. It was the 19th century version of leasing a sports car for the weekend. The guest list made things worse. Victorian society demanded inclusion of not just close family, but distant cousins, business partners, neighbours, and anyone who might be offended if excluded. Each guest meant another mouth to feed, another plate of spoiled meat or gelatinous horror to finance. Declining to invite someone could spark lasting feuds. Entire communities judged families on the size of the crowd, as though popularity equated to virtue. A wedding with a small guest list was whispered about as either miserly or shameful, forcing hosts to extend invitations until the costs spiraled beyond control. Clothing expenditures piled up as well. It was not enough for the bride to have one gown. Multiple outfits were often commissioned for the day itself and for subsequent appearances during the honeymoon. Guests were also expected to arrive in finery, which meant families of modest means often went into debt buying or renting suitable attire. For men, starched shirts, waistcoats, and cravats required laundering and pressing by professionals. For women, gowns demanded fittings, trims, and accessories that accumulated into staggering totals. Even the flowers pinned to lapels and hair were priced with cruelty, their short lives matched only by the brevity of the savings accounts they drained. Middle-class families in particular struggled under these demands. Rising industrial wealth had created new money eager to imitate aristocratic customs, but without the endless estates to fund them. A prosperous shopkeeper or clerk might spend a year's income on a single wedding, leaving nothing for emergencies. Loans were taken out quietly, debts accumulated, and in some cases, bankruptcy followed what had been trumpeted as the happiest day of a daughter's life. The irony was painful. A celebration intended to launch a marriage often left the family worse off than before, saddling them with obligations they could never recover from. For women, the financial strain was deeply tied to their value in the marriage market. A lavish wedding was seen as proof of respectability and refinement, signalling to society that the bride came from a family of means. Even if the family had mortgaged half their belongings to stage the event, the illusion mattered more than reality. Dowries too played into the ruinous equation. Though less standardized than in earlier centuries, contributions of land, cash or goods were often expected, further draining households desperate to present themselves as worthy matches. Servants bore witness to the absurdity of it all. Letters and memoirs from the period describe frantic preparations, kitchens stretched beyond capacity, and families pawning valuables to pay for extra staff. Temporary cooks, footmen, and maids were hired for the event, swelling the household to army-like proportions. Yet many of these workers went unpaid for weeks, waiting until the family could scrape together enough to settle accounts. The glittering spectacle seen by the guests was underpinned by financial chaos that rippled for months afterward. Even newspapers mocked the excess. Satirical magazines published cartoons of fathers clutching empty purses, while brides paraded in gowns covered with jewels. Articles warned of reckless extravagance, noting that entire fortunes could vanish in a single weekend. Yet the cycle continued. No one wanted to be the family remembered for staging a modest wedding. Appearances had to be maintained, even if it meant sliding deeper into debt. The scale of financial ruin extended beyond individual families. Industries grew fat on the back of Victorian weddings. Dressmakers, jewellers, printers, florists and caterers thrived, exploiting the desperation of hosts who feared embarrassment more than insolvency. Weddings became engines of commerce, fueling consumer culture at a time when Britain's economy was transforming under industrial capitalism. Love may have been the excuse, but profit was the outcome. You can almost hear the sound of coin purses snapping shut, creditors knocking on doors, and whispers spreading through parlours about who overspent and who underdelivered. The financial burden was not temporary. It lingered long after the flowers had wilted and the guests had gone home. Families staggered under debts while newlyweds entered their marriages, already weighed down by the consequences of their own celebrations. In the pursuit of spectacle, the Victorians turned weddings into traps, gilded cages lined with receipts, and yet the demands did not end there. Beyond the bills and the debts lay another ritual that pressed relentlessly on the couple, one that demanded not money, but flesh. Because after the feasts, the gifts, and the endless expenses, society turned its gaze toward the womb, and the pressure to produce children began before the last candle of the reception had even burned out. The ink has barely dried on the bills from the wedding feast, and the last bouquet has already wilted, but Victorian society does not pause to let the couple breathe. Its eyes turn immediately to the one subject more pressing than gowns, debts, or dowries: fertility. The true measure of a wedding success was not the vows spoken or the champagne spilled. It was the speed with which the bride's body began to swell with an air. From the moment the ceremony ended, a clock began ticking, not for romance but for reproduction. For the Victorians, children were not simply the result of marriage, they were its justification. Families whispered eagerly about the timing of conception, with mothers-in-law counting months on their fingers and neighbours speculating about the health of the union. Medical texts urged couples to begin their duty without delay, presenting childbirth as both a biological expectation and a moral obligation. To fail was to invite suspicion. If a year passed without evidence of pregnancy, tongues wagged and reputations suffered. The bride carried the greater burden of this expectation. Her body became public property, scrutinised by family, servants, and society at large. Every change in appetite, every fainting spell, every shift in complexion was interpreted as a possible sign of pregnancy. If she glowed, she was praised. If she did not, she was pitied or blamed. The language of fertility transformed natural human uncertainty into social theatre. Privacy disappeared, replaced by an ongoing performance measured in swollen bellies and cradle-bound infants. Superstition crowded the process with absurd rituals. Couples were advised on favourable times of day to conceive, with some medical guides recommending early morning encounters as the most productive, as though sperm and eggs adhered to Victorian office hours. Diet was also policed. Brides were urged to consume milk, beef and ale for strength, while avoiding foods believed to upset the delicate balance of humours. Folklore even suggested that lying on certain sides of the body could determine the sex of the child. Families clung to these practices with an earnestness that today reads as comic, but then carried the weight of destiny. The obsession with heirs was not purely sentimental. Property, titles and inheritance depended on them. In upper-class households, the birth of a son secured the future of estates, while the absence of one threatened to scatter fortunes. Even among the middle classes, children were seen as insurance for old age, future labourers for businesses, or simply symbols of prosperity. The failure to produce them destabilised marriages, fueled gossip, and often led to humiliation. Infertility was rarely attributed to men. Instead, women bore the blame, subjected to treatments that ranged from the useless to the dangerous. Victorian medicine offered little comfort. Doctors prescribed rescuers, electric belts, and bizarre tonics meant to stimulate fertility. Some treatments involved the application of leeches, others the ingestion of mercury or strychnine in diluted forms. The desperation for children made couples willing to try almost anything. One widely advertised product promised to restore vital energy with a combination of herbs and alcohol strong enough to incapacitate a horse. It did not solve infertility, but it certainly made people forget about it for a while. The pressure extended to the very structure of daily life. Newlyweds were encouraged to maintain schedules designed around reproduction, with strict guidelines about frequency, timing, and even posture. Love had little place in the equation. The act was transformed into an obligation, a clinical routine performed under the shadow of social expectation. The romantic ideals presented in Victorian novels were crushed beneath the weight of practical demands. Couples were not simply two people building a life together. They were vessels tasked with ensuring the continuity of bloodlines, businesses, and reputations. Letters and diaries reveal the toll this obsession took. Brides wrote of feeling more like breeding stock than partners, of being measured constantly against the success of their wombs. Husbands recorded anxieties about producing heirs, even when their own health or habits may have been at fault. Servants gossiped about the timing of missed cycles, passing news between households as though pregnancy was public entertainment. Entire communities became invested in the reproductive outcomes of marriages, erasing any illusion of intimacy. Complications were frequent. Miscarriages were tragically common, yet often hidden in silence. Families spoke of them in whispers, blaming the mother for weakness or carelessness. Medical knowledge was too limited to offer explanations, so superstition filled the void. A fall downstairs, a fright from thunder, or even reading too much could be blamed for the loss of a child. Women endured grief in isolation, expected to try again quickly, as though reproduction were a duty that could not be interrupted by mourning. Childbirth itself was perilous. With limited understanding of infection, no antibiotics, and limited pain relief, labour carried risks that could claim both mother and child. Yet even this danger did not lessen the expectation. Death in childbirth was treated as tragic but almost routine, a sacrifice folded neatly into the narrative of duty. The sheer number of funerary monuments dedicated to young mothers in Victorian cemeteries testifies to how common the sacrifice was. To society, their deaths were mourned. To their families, their absence was filled with renewed pressure on surviving women to take their place. You can picture the parlour filled with whispers, the servants leaning in doorways, the doctor arriving with a grim face and outdated instruments. The bride, exhausted from months of scrutiny, lies pale under a blanket, her body bearing the burden of expectation that never truly lifted. Fertility was not an option. It was a sentence handed down by society, disguised as destiny. And even when children were born, the ordeal did not end, because Victorian weddings were not simply about producing heirs. They were also about ensuring that those children were raised within a system of rigid morality, punishing discipline and unrelenting conformity. The cycle of inhumanity did not pause at birth. It continued into childhood, where the legacy of these marriages shaped lives long after the vows were spoken. The first cries of an infant echo through the household, and while the family beams with pride, the child's very existence is already entangled in the machinery set in motion by the wedding. Victorian weddings were never about two individuals starting a quiet life together. They were about manufacturing heirs, extensions of status, and tiny participants in a system of ritual and obligation. From the moment a child drew breath, their role was defined not by who they were, but by what they represented. The pressure on children began before they could even walk. Birth announcements were sent out like battle reports, printed on embossed cards and distributed through social networks that thrived on comparison. Every detail was scrutinized. The weight of the child, the swiftness of the delivery, even the appearance of the mother was noted, catalogued and whispered about in parlours. The child was less an individual than a symbol of whether the marriage had fulfilled its sacred duty. If the child was a son, the household erupted with triumph. Inheritance, lineage and family stability were secure, at least for the moment. If the child was a daughter, the celebration was often more muted. Victorian society valued women primarily as future brides themselves, bargaining chips for alliances and dowries. Families sighed with relief at healthy births, but secretly longed for boys to carry names and fortunes forward. Mothers, blamed unfairly for the sex of their children, bore the brunt of disappointment if daughters arrived too often in succession. The nursery became the stage for the next act of inhumanity. Wealthier families separated children from their parents almost immediately, relegating them to the care of nurses and governesses. bonds of affection were fractured in the name of propriety. Mothers, praised publicly for their fertility, were often discouraged from breastfeeding, instructed instead to pass the duty to wet nurses, who sometimes nursed multiple infants at once, increasing the risk of disease. Infants were treated like commodities, farmed out for care while their parents focused on appearances and social obligations. The clothing of children reflected the same suffocating obsession with image. Even toddlers were trussed up in stiff fabrics, starched collars, and elaborate frills that restricted movement. Comfort was secondary to presentation. Photographs, increasingly popular in the mid-century, captured solemn little faces staring out from layers of lace, looking less like children than miniature mannequins. Mortality was so common that some families commissioned post-mortem portraits, dressing dead infants in finery to preserve the illusion of prosperity and stability even in grief. These haunting images filled albums, reminders that even loss was folded into the spectacle of appearances. Education mirrored the burden. Boys destined for inheritance were drilled in Latin, arithmetic, and manners from an early age, their days regimented into routines that prepared them to manage property rather than enjoy childhood. Girls were trained in music, embroidery, and polite conversation, their futures reduced to preparation for marriages that would repeat the cycle of performance and debt. Play, when allowed, was structured and supervised, infused with moral lessons about obedience and duty. The idea that children should be carefree was alien. Instead, they were groomed as future actors in the relentless theatre of Victorian society. Healthcare for children was a grim parody of science. Medical texts brimmed with dubious advice, from dosing infants with opium syrups to quiet their cries, to insisting that cold baths toughen their constitutions. Teething powders laced with mercury were sold openly, poisoning countless babies whose only crime was growing teeth too noisily. Childhood was treated less as a stage of growth, and more as a series of nuisances to be controlled, medicated and disciplined. Parents boasted of strong, obedient children, ignoring that much of their survival was a matter of chance in an age when diphtheria, scarlet fever and cholera lurked in every neighbourhood. The role of the wedding in this cycle cannot be overstated. Every expectation tied to the marriage, fertility, inheritance, reputation, funneled directly into the lives of children. They were born not as free individuals, but as living proof of their parents' social success or failure. A son's health meant triumph. A daughter's birth meant recalculating dowries. A sickly child meant whispered suspicions about weak bloodlines. Even the number of children became a measure of respectability. Families with too few faced rumours of infertility. Families with too many risked financial collapse under the weight of mouths to feed. Servants once again witnessed the contradictions. Nurses recorded in private journals the misery of children raised without affection, noting how they clung desperately to any kindness. Governesses complained of being tasked with raising future heirs who barely knew their own parents. Meanwhile, the upper classes paraded their children in public, immaculate in dress and posture, as though polishing away the reality of their fragile existence. The spectacle of childhood was curated with the same precision as the wedding that had created it, every detail crafted to impress rather than nurture. Mortality haunted it all. 1 in 5 children in Victorian Britain died before the age of 5. Families mourned, but even grief became ritualised. Black crepe draped nurseries, mourning clothes were stitched for siblings, and elaborate funerals marked the passing of infants whose lives had barely begun. Death was folded into the system, accepted as inevitable, yet still used to reinforce narratives of duty. A mother who lost a child was urged to conceive again quickly, continuing the cycle as though nothing had changed. You can almost hear the faint creak of a cradle in a dark nursery, the rattle of medicine bottles on a shelf, the whispers of servants in the hallway. The laughter of children when it came was muffled by layers of lace, duty, and constant supervision. Their lives were shaped entirely by the institution of marriage, their futures charted before they could even speak. And as those children grew, they were fed directly back into the system. Sons became heirs to manage debts created by their parents' weddings. Daughters were groomed for marriages that would repeat the spectacle. The cycle of inhumanity was unbroken, and while the nursery carried its burdens, another arena awaited the couple themselves, one where social expectation returned with suffocating force. Because after children, the couple was judged on how they entertained, and Victorian standards of hospitality turned ordinary households into stages of endless labour and expense. The nursery may be filled with the cries of children, but the drawing room is where the real battles begin. A Victorian marriage was not complete once vows were spoken or heirs produced. It had to be reinforced through hospitality, an endless gauntlet of dinners, teas and gatherings that turned households into theatres of status. Once married, couples were no longer private individuals. They became hosts, their homes transformed into stages where every table setting, every cup of tea, every crumb of cake spoke volumes about their social worth. Hosting was not optional. Invitations had to be returned with equal enthusiasm, and to decline too often was to risk being cut off from the networks that defined Victorian life. A family's reputation hinged on its ability to entertain. Yet entertaining came at a cost that few could bear comfortably. Elaborate meals were expected, servants had to be managed, and drawing rooms had to be dressed with the latest fashions. Guests did not come to relax. They came to inspect. The meal was the centrepiece of these gatherings, and it was rarely simple. Etiquette manuals prescribed a dizzying array of courses: soup, fish, roast, game, sweets, and cheese arrived in sequence, accompanied by wines carefully matched to each dish. To serve fewer than 6 courses was to risk whispers of poverty. To serve more than 12 was to invite accusations of vulgarity. The line between refinement and excess was thin, and families stumbled across it constantly. Food had to be displayed with flair, sometimes sculpted into elaborate shapes. Entire animals were reassembled to look alive again, feathers stitched back onto roasted birds, antlers placed near venison. Guests clapped politely, ignoring the faint smell of rot that accompanied these centerpieces. Afternoon tea, which might sound simple today, was itself a financial trap. By the late 19th century, it had become an institution, complete with fine china, silver teapots, delicate sandwiches, and cakes arranged like architectural marvels. The tea itself was imported at great cost, often adulterated with brick dust or used leaves re-dyed to stretch supply. Sugar, heavily taxed until the mid-century, was a luxury that families flaunted in heaps, sweetening everything to the point of absurdity. Even a casual tea gathering could drain a week's wages, yet hosts felt compelled to offer the spread, lest they appear miserly. The physical burden fell heavily on servants, who orchestrated these displays behind the scenes. Kitchens roared with coal stoves, smoke and heat, while cooks prepared dishes that demanded precision with limited equipment. Footmen polished silver until their hands cracked, maids scrubbed tablecloths free of wine stains, and butlers drilled the staff on timing. A mistimed course or a scuffed plate could mean disgrace. For middle-class families without large staffs, the burden fell on the bride herself, expected to manage, supervise, and sometimes cook while still appearing radiant in the drawing room. Hospitality became not just labour, but unpaid performance. Even the home itself had to be curated. Drawing rooms were showcases of respectability, decorated with furniture purchased on credit and ornaments displayed for admiration. Guests judged not just the conversation, but the wallpaper, the carpets, even the arrangement of knickknacks. Dust was seen as moral failure, clutter as evidence of weakness. Families went to absurd lengths to maintain appearances, sometimes arranging rooms so that only one space was fully furnished and clean, funneling all guests into that single illusion of prosperity. The rest of the house languished, hidden behind closed doors, The rituals extended beyond meals and decor. Conversation was a battlefield of wit and restraint. Men were expected to discuss politics and science, women to display knowledge of literature, music or art without seeming too intellectual. A misplaced comment could brand someone as dull, vulgar, or worse, radical. Etiquette manuals drilled couples on appropriate topics, warning against jokes, strong opinions, or too much laughter. Hospitality was meant to look effortless, but it demanded constant vigilance, rehearsed performances, and nerves of steel. And none of this was occasional. Invitations flowed constantly, and each one had to be reciprocated. Declining too often was a social sin, but accepting meant sinking deeper into the cycle of expenditure and labour. Families bankrupted themselves trying to maintain appearances, while guests moved from house to house consuming meals they barely remembered. Hospitality was not about joy or generosity. It was about survival in a world where exclusion meant ruin. The absurdity reached its peak in the invention of at-home days. Married women announced specific afternoons when they would be available to receive visitors. Cards bearing these times were distributed, and on the appointed day, acquaintances arrived in waves to drink tea, nibble cakes, and inspect the household. The hostess was trapped, pinned in her drawing room for hours, repeating the same pleasantries until her face ached. Failure to participate meant social invisibility. Success meant exhaustion. The performance had no end. You can almost hear the clink of china, the scratch of silver on porcelain, the murmurs of carefully measured conversation drifting under the haze of coal smoke. Behind the smiles lies anxiety, debt, and endless preparation. A Victorian wedding did not lead to a private life of partnership. It opened the door to a lifetime of entertaining that consumed time, money, and health. And as exhausting as hospitality was, it paled compared to the scrutiny that came with anniversaries. Because Victorians were not content with one spectacle. They demanded repeated commemorations, each one grander than the last, turning even the passage of time into another stage for excess and obligation. The last guest leaves, the silver spoons are locked back in their drawer, and for a brief moment you imagine peace. But the Victorian calendar was relentless. Weddings were never one-day spectacles. They spawned anniversaries, a cycle of commemorations that stretched on year after year, each one demanding more performance, more expense, and more opportunities for public scrutiny. If the wedding itself was a battlefield, anniversaries were the prolonged siege, a reminder that marriage in Victorian Britain was less about intimacy than about endless obligation. The notion of celebrating anniversaries was not new, but Victorians industrialised it. By the mid-19th century, anniversary rituals were codified into a hierarchy of gifts, each tied to specific years of marriage. The first year was paper, fragile and easily destroyed, a symbolism that was not lost on couples who already staggered under debt and pressure. 5 years brought wood, 10 years tin, 15 crystal, 20 silver, and eventually 50 gold. The symbolism was marketed as sentimental, but in practice it was another financial trap. Families were expected to purchase tokens of increasing value, each one another expense layered on top of the debts already created by the wedding itself. Merchants embraced the trend with enthusiasm. Shops filled with anniversary goods, from paper cards and tin ornaments to silver goblets and gold lockets. Magazines published lists of suitable gifts, urging husbands and wives to demonstrate devotion through objects rather than affection. Failure to participate risked embarrassment, as neighbours compared who had received what and whether the gift was appropriate to the milestone. Anniversaries became less about surviving another year of marriage and more about advertising that survival to the world. The parties that accompanied these anniversaries could be as elaborate as weddings themselves. Families invited guests back into their drawing rooms, parading the couple as though they were artifacts on display. Speeches were given, toasts raised, and gifts presented publicly. echoing the humiliating rituals of the original ceremony. In some cases, newspapers reported on prominent anniversaries, listing the presents received and the social standing of attendees. Privacy was a foreign concept. Every stage of marriage was subject to the gaze of society, anniversaries included. Superstition crept into these rituals as well. It was said that failing to observe an anniversary properly risked misfortune, illness, or even the breakdown of the marriage. Husbands were reminded that a forgotten anniversary was not just careless, but dangerous, inviting bad luck into the household. Wives were pressured to orchestrate celebrations even when exhausted, ensuring that guests were entertained and appearances preserved. The entire institution became another machine of obligation, churning relentlessly year after year. For many couples, the anniversary was less joyful commemoration than grim reminder. A paper token after 1 year meant little when debts remained unpaid. A silver goblet at 20 years did not erase the memory of lost children, infidelities, or exhaustion. Yet the rituals continued, propped up by etiquette manuals and social expectation. Even grief was folded into the system. Widows were sometimes expected to commemorate anniversaries of marriages long ended, their mourning attire updated with each passing year, as though memory itself had to be performed. The commercialization was staggering. Jewelers advertised anniversary gifts months in advance, inventing new categories for years not traditionally celebrated. Stationers sold embossed cards, florists hawked out-of-season blooms, and confectioners offered cakes decorated with symbols of longevity. The machine of consumption never rested. Marriage anniversaries became annual opportunities for profit, each one draining resources while offering little in return. You can almost see the parlour filled again, guests sipping tea, the couple seated stiffly as another round of toasts begins. The silver goblets gleam, the crystal glasses clink, and yet beneath the surface there is fatigue, the weight of decades spent performing. The anniversary, far from being a private triumph, is transformed into another public ordeal. And while the rituals of gifts and parties consume the couple's later years, they were still shadowed by one more inhuman burden. Because marriage was not only about spouses and heirs, it was also about law, contracts, and the merciless legal system that bound women to their husbands, with chains stronger than iron. The clinking of anniversary goblets may still echo in the parlour, but beneath all the silver, lace and ribbons lurked something far heavier than debt or duty. The true inhumanity of a Victorian wedding was not only in its ceremonies or customs, but in the legal trap it created. With a single vow, a bride ceased to exist as an independent person. Marriage in the 19th century was not a partnership. It was a contract of ownership, drafted and enforced by laws that reduced women to property in everything but name. The system was called coverture, a legal doctrine inherited from earlier centuries but sharpened under Victorian society. Under coverture, a married woman's identity was literally absorbed into her husband's. She could not own property in her own right. She could not sign contracts, sue in court, or control her own earnings. The moment she said, "I do," everything she had, from her dowry to her wages to the clothes on her back, became his. The law referred to husband and wife as one person, which sounds romantic until you realise the one person was him. Even inheritance was stripped away. If a woman owned land before marriage, it transferred to her husband's control. If she came into money, it was immediately his to spend. Widows fared little better, often forced to fight through courts for portions of estates that legally belonged to their children or male relatives. Women were told that they were protected, but the protection was hollow. It meant being locked out of the most basic rights to autonomy, all under the guise of sacred vows. The injustice extended to daily life. Wages earned by a wife belonged legally to her husband, even if she worked long hours in factories, shops, or as a governess. Letters from women of the era describe handing over entire salaries, while their husbands squandered them on drink or gambling. A wife who protested had no legal recourse. She could not separate her finances. She could not claim her own income. Her labour, like her body, was considered part of her husband's property. divorce, while technically possible, was practically unattainable for women. The Matrimonial Causes Act of 1857 allowed civil divorce for the first time, but the terms were unequal. A man could divorce his wife on grounds of simple adultery. A woman, however, had to prove not only adultery but additional offences such as cruelty, desertion, or incest. The burden of proof was immense, the costs astronomical, and the social consequences ruinous. For most women, divorce was not an option. They remained legally tied to men who might mistreat, abandon, or exploit them, with no hope of release. Custody of children compounded the cruelty. Until reforms in the late 19th century, children automatically belonged to the father in the event of separation. A mother had no right to keep her offspring no matter the circumstances. Countless women endured loveless or abusive marriages simply to remain near their children, trapped by laws that valued paternal authority over maternal bonds. Campaigners like Caroline Norton, herself a victim of this system, fought tirelessly for change, writing pamphlets that exposed the brutality of the laws, but progress was glacial. Even violence fell under the cloak of legality. A husband was expected to discipline his wife as he saw fit, provided he did not go so far as to kill her. The infamous rule of thumb, the idea that a man could beat his wife with a stick no thicker than his thumb, lingered in common thought, if not formal statute, well into the Victorian era. Courts often dismissed cases of domestic abuse, framing them as private matters outside the realm of law. A wife could scream, bruise, or bleed, but unless the violence threatened her life, society looked away. Marriage contracts extended into the absurd. Women of means were sometimes pressured to sign settlements before marriage, handing over control of their fortunes to male trustees who managed them on the husband's behalf. The logic was that women were too delicate to handle money, yet sturdy enough to survive repeated childbirth. Legal documents turned brides into financial ghosts, present in the home but absent on paper. Their signatures meant nothing. Their voices carried no weight. Reformers did eventually chip away at these shackles. The Married Women's Property Acts of 1870 and 1882 granted wives the right to keep earnings and property in their own names, landmark changes that shifted the balance slightly. But even then, the stigma of independence lingered. Women who asserted control over their own finances were labelled unfeminine, selfish, or dangerous. Respectable society clung stubbornly to the idea that marriage was sacred precisely because it was unequal. For men, the contract offered power without responsibility. A husband could squander his wife's fortune, deny her freedom, and still enjoy legal protection. He was free to take mistresses, free to drink away household income, free to vanish for weeks at a time, leaving his family destitute without fear of legal consequence. The wedding vows, presented as solemn commitments, were in reality legal shackles that bound women to lives of dependency and submission. You can almost picture the bride at her writing desk, pen hovering over paper, her name replaced by her husband's, her fortune signed away before she even lifted the nib. Outside, the parlour is filled with guests admiring silver trinkets and embroidered linens, unaware or uninterested in the fact that the woman at the centre of the spectacle has legally vanished. The inhumanity of the wedding was not only in its ceremonies but in its aftermath, where love was eclipsed by law and vows became cages. And while the legal system locked women into subservience, the social system pressed down with equal weight. For once married, a woman's entire identity was reshaped into the suffocating role of wife, a role defined not by her desires or abilities but by rigid expectations of obedience, purity, and sacrifice. The ink of the marriage contract may have stripped her rights on paper, but society did not stop there. The real inhumanity lay in the role that came afterward. To be a wife in Victorian Britain was to step into a costume stitched not with lace and satin, but with obedience, submission, and ceaseless performance. The wedding created the wife, and the wife became less a person than a role to be played with suffocating precision. From the moment vows were spoken, A woman was expected to embody the ideal of the angel in the house. This phrase, popularised by Coventry Patmore's 1854 poem, became the defining archetype of Victorian womanhood. A wife was meant to be pure, selfless, endlessly patient, and devoted to her husband's needs above her own. She was to manage the household with grace, raise children with quiet efficiency, and serve as the moral compass of the family. To deviate from this script was to invite condemnation. The absurdity of the expectation becomes clearer when you examine the contradictions. Women were to be submissive, yet also the guardians of morality. They were to be modest, yet dazzling enough to reflect positively on their husbands. They were to be industrious, yet too delicate for serious labour. They were urged to be educated enough to converse politely, but never so learned that they threatened male authority. It was a tightrope walked daily, and falling on either side meant ridicule, gossip, or social exile. Household management became one of the wife's central duties, but it was hardly simple. Middle and upper-class homes were complex machines staffed by servants, each one requiring oversight. A wife was expected to supervise cleaning, cooking, laundering, and child-rearing, ensuring the household ran like clockwork. Manuals instructed women to rise early, inspect linens, taste dishes, and monitor servants with vigilance. Failure to notice a dusty mantelpiece or scorched pudding could be interpreted as moral weakness. The home itself was framed as a reflection of her virtue, as though every scuff on the floorboards revealed a flaw in her character. Even her body was subject to scrutiny. Fashion demanded that wives maintain appearances that often bordered on self-harm. Corsets restricted breathing, elaborate hairstyles pulled at scalps, and cosmetics were frowned upon, leaving women to rely on dangerous complexion waters laced with lead and arsenic. To appear tired or aged too soon was to suggest negligence, to betray that a woman was not fulfilling her duties properly. The pressure to look the part was constant, even while exhaustion and repeated childbirth drained her strength. Marriage also reshaped social behaviour. A wife could no longer mingle freely or pursue her own interests without judgment. Attendance at church was mandatory, both for piety and visibility. Visits to neighbours had to be carefully scheduled and reciprocated. Even letters were policed, with the expectation that wives write graciously and frequently, never hinting at dissatisfaction. A careless remark could spark rumours that rippled through entire communities. In this way, a woman's private life was never truly private. Every action was fodder for collective judgment. For working-class wives, the expectations were different but no less cruel. They were expected to contribute to family income through labour in factories, laundries, or as seamstresses, while still managing households without servants. They endured 12-hour shifts only to return home to cook, clean, and raise children. Respectability demanded that they keep houses spotless despite poverty, with neighbours ready to criticise at the slightest slip. They faced the double burden of wage labour and domestic servitude, trapped in cycles of exhaustion that left no space for individuality. Religion magnified these pressures. Sermons reminded wives of their duty to obey husbands, citing scripture as justification for submission. Religious tracts distributed widely emphasised the sanctity of sacrifice, urging women to find fulfilment in service and suffering. The pulpit reinforced what the law and society already demanded. A wife's path to salvation was obedience, even if it meant erasing herself entirely. Satirical magazines occasionally mocked these contradictions, depicting wives as weary figures crushed under mountains of children, dishes, and debts. But satire did not change reality. The angel in the house remained the ideal, impossible to achieve yet unavoidable. It was a fantasy that consumed real lives, draining women of freedom, health, and identity. You can almost picture her standing in the parlour, smile fixed, corset digging, voice gentle as she thanks guests for their compliments. Behind her eyes is exhaustion. Behind her posture, the ache of labour unacknowledged. Her life, shaped by the wedding, is one of ceaseless performance, a role scripted by men, enforced by law, and perpetuated by gossip. And as suffocating as these expectations were, they extended beyond her lifetime. For even in death, a Victorian wife's identity remained bound to her role, her tombstone inscribed less with her name than with her title as beloved spouse and mother, leaving behind a legacy of erasure as complete as the marriage contract that had swallowed her on her wedding day. The parlour may have seen countless teas, gifts and anniversaries, but eventually the role carved by the wedding ends in silence. Death was never far from a Victorian marriage, particularly for wives whose bodies bore the cost of repeated childbirth, household strain, and relentless social duty. Weddings were framed as beginnings, but in reality they were often the start of a slow march toward an early grave. The rituals surrounding that end were as elaborate, invasive, and inhuman as the marriage itself. Mortality shadowed Victorian women at every turn. The average middle-class wife could expect to spend much of her adult life either pregnant, recovering from pregnancy, or burying children lost to illness. Maternal mortality rates remained high, with infections like puerperal fever cutting lives short in days. Doctors, often ignorant of hygiene, moved from autopsies to deliveries without washing their hands, carrying bacteria that claimed mothers with alarming regularity. A wedding that promised happiness often delivered a coffin within a decade. When death arrived, it did not free the wife from her role, it extended it. Mourning was a social obligation as rigidly enforced as any vow. Widows were expected to wear black for months or even years, depending on class and circumstance. Entire wardrobes were replaced with heavy crepe fabrics that absorbed soot and smelled perpetually of damp. Jewellery was refashioned to include locks of hair or photographs of the deceased, transforming grief into fashion. Even the body of the wife herself, when she was the one to die, was dressed in ways that reinforced her identity not as an individual but as a spouse. Tombstones rarely bore her first name. Instead, they proclaimed her status: beloved wife, devoted mother, faithful partner. The funeral industry, booming in the 19th century, feasted on these expectations. Undertakers offered packages that included mourning carriages, veils, and decorative plumes for horses. Etiquette manuals prescribed precisely how long one must wear black, how many visitors must be received in the mourning period, and what expressions of grief were appropriate. Failure to perform grief correctly invited scandal. Too little sadness was indecent. Too much was vulgar. Mourning was not about healing. It was about performance. Another extension of the wedding's endless cycle of appearances. Even children were drawn into this theatre. Mourning clothes were tailored for infants and toddlers, photographs taken of entire families dressed in black, faces solemn for the camera's long exposure. The dead were sometimes propped up in post-mortem portraits, arranged among the living as though they had simply paused for a moment's rest. Death was transformed into another stage of the wedding ritual, proof that the bonds formed in life extended into the grave, whether the individuals involved desired it or not. Widows endured their own unique burdens. Though some inherited wealth through careful settlements, many were left destitute, their property controlled by trustees or relatives. A widow's role was defined not by freedom, but by continued responsibility. She was expected to maintain her husband's memory, guard her children's futures, and withdraw from society until a prescribed period of mourning passed. Remarriage was possible, but often judged harshly, as though devotion required a lifetime of celibacy after widowhood. Women who remarried too quickly were mocked in the press, while those who did not were left impoverished. Men, by contrast, often escaped these shackles. A widower could remarry within months, sometimes even weeks, without fear of censure. He retained property, custody of children, and freedom to rebuild his household swiftly. The imbalance was stark. A wife's death was treated as a reminder of her service. A husband's was treated as an inconvenience to be managed with new companionship. The asymmetry revealed how little the individual woman mattered beyond her role as wife. The symbols of mourning themselves carried hidden cruelties. Black crepe, the fabric most associated with mourning attire, was not only heavy but dangerous. The dye used to achieve its deep black often contained arsenic, causing rashes, sores, and even poisoning for those forced to wear it daily. Women who spent months or years dressed in mourning literally absorbed toxins from their clothing, their grief compounded by illness. Jewellery made from human hair carried its own risks, often collected from corpses without sterilisation, spreading disease in subtle and unseen ways. Even in death, the rituals devised to honour love inflicted suffering. The obsession with death anniversaries extended the cycle further. Just as wedding anniversaries demanded tokens and gatherings, so too did death dates require solemn observances. Families gathered annually to commemorate the passing of spouses, dressing in black and revisiting graves. Mourning, like marriage, became endless, a performance that consumed lives long after the original vows had been spoken. You can almost hear the slow tolling of a funeral bell in a foggy Victorian street, the creak of a black carriage, the shuffle of mourners dressed in suffocating crepe. A woman who once stood as a bride in arsenic lace now lies in a coffin, her name erased beneath the title of wife, her individuality dissolved into a role she never escaped. Marriage in Victorian Britain was not only an inhuman institution in life, it was a contract that reached into the grave, binding women even in death to the identities that weddings had forced upon them. If you've enjoyed this gentle stroll through arsenic, spoiled meat, fainting, debt and lifelong misery, congratulations. You now qualify as a veteran of Victorian weddings. I'd love to know which tale of historical suffering you want to hear next, so drop your suggestions in the comments. And if you actually find relaxation in listening to humanity's worst decisions dressed up as tradition, make sure to check out my other videos. There's plenty more discomfort from the past to help you drift off to sleep.